The sun over the English Channel was a pale, watery coin in a vast, grey sky, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the world, leaching color from the land and sea below. For Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann of Jagdgeschwader 52, it was a hunter's sky. His fingers, encased in leather gloves, rested lightly on the stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G. The aircraft was a part of him, an extension of his will, sleek, predatory, with the angular, aggressive lines of a shark. The Daimler-Benz engine thrummed a powerful, confident song behind him. Through the curved glass of the canopy, he scanned the endless expanse, his eyes, a piercing blue, missing nothing. He was 20 years old, already an ace with 43 victories painted in neat black crosses on the yellow rudder of his fighter. He believed in his machine, in his skill, in the invincible combination of the two. The war in the air over Europe was, to men like Hartmann, a duel of knights. It was about finesse, energy, the perfect deflection shot, the physics of the turn. It was about the Spitfire, a nimble, beautiful dancer of an aircraft, and the Focke-Wulf 190, a brutal, snarling brawler. These were worthy opponents. And then there were the Americans. A crackle in his headset, the voice of his wingman, a young, eager pilot named Fischer. Herr Oberleutnant, bogies. 3 o'clock low. Coming out of the haze. Big ones. Hartmann's gaze shifted. There, emerging from the woolly grey blanket that shrouded the French coast, were shapes. They were not the slender, graceful silhouettes of Spitfires. These were enormous, hulking. They looked less like fighters and more like flying barrels with wings stuck on as an afterthought. They had a massive, radial engine at the front, a deep, tubby fuselage, and wings that were surprisingly straight and thick. They flew in a loose, comfortable formation, climbing steadily from England towards the continent. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Jug. Hartmann allowed himself a small, derisive smile behind his oxygen mask. Kahi, he muttered. Cows. The intelligence briefings had been dismissive. Heavy. Slow to climb. Unmaneuverable. A stable gun platform for ground attack, perhaps, but in the rarefied air of a dogfight. A joke. A fat, slow, laughing stock of a joke. Fischer's laughter echoed in his ears. Shall we teach the farm boys some manners, Herr Oberleutnant? Hartmann keyed his mic, his voice calm, professional. J.A., Fischer. Follow me. Line astern. We take them from above and behind. One pass, then away. They cannot follow us in the vertical. It was textbook. The 109 held every advantage: a better power-to-weight ratio, a superior rate of climb. They would dive from the sun, a lightning strike, claim a kill or two, and use their speed to climb back to safety before the cumbersome jugs could even think about turning. It was less a fight and more a culling. He rolled his aircraft onto its wing, the world tilting, and began the descent. The airspeed bled away, traded for the silent, gathering potential of the dive. The two 109s, slate gray against the gray sky, became arrows pointed at the unsuspecting formation below. In the cockpit of the lead P-47, Captain Jimmy Thatch of the 56th Fighter Group felt a familiar, low-grade tension humming in his veins. It was not fear, but a hyper-awareness, a tightening of every sense. He loved his aircraft with a ferocity that bordered on the religious. To the untrained eye, the Thunderbolt was ugly, brutish. To Thatch, it was pure, unadulterated power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine behind him wasn't just an engine, it was a 2,000 horsepower earthquake contained in a cowling. The airframe wasn't heavy, it was solid, built to take punishment that would tear a 109 or a 190 apart. And the armament. He glanced at the arming switches for the 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. They were not guns, they were a convergence of industrial might, a hailstorm of lead waiting to be unleashed. He knew what the Germans thought of his Jug. He'd heard the radio intercepts, the arrogant chatter. Let them laugh. His job today wasn't to duel with their fighters. His job was to get his little friends, the bombers, a vast, staggering armada of B-17 flying fortresses, to the target and back. The 109s were an annoyance, flies to be swatted. But the flies today were particularly bold. His wingman, a fresh-faced kid from Oklahoma named Lieutenant Roy Shorty Jenkins, called it bandits. 2 o'clock high. 109s, coming down fast. Thatch's eyes flicked upwards. There they were. 2 grey specks growing with terrifying speed. The classic bounce. He felt a surge not of panic, but of grim satisfaction. All right, boys, his voice was a gravelly drawl over the squadron frequency. Here comes the comedy act. Remember the drill. Don't try to turn with them. Don't chase them. Let them come. Wait for it. Wait for it. He kept his climb steady, a fat, tempting target. In his mind, he could see Hartmann's sight picture, the pipper settling on his cockpit. Any second now, the twin 13mm machine guns and the 20mm cannon in the 109's nose would spark to life. Hartmann's pipper was indeed centered on the deep fuselage of the lead Thunderbolt. The range closed, 600 meters, 500, 400. He could see the individual rivets on the wings, the olive drab paint. His thumb rested on the cannon button. This was too easy. At 300 meters, he pressed it. A bright flash of cannon shells spat from his aircraft, streaking towards the American. And then the world changed. The massive P-47, which had been plodding along like a freight train, simply vanished from his sights. It wasn't a graceful, banking turn. It was a violent, physics-defying snap roll to the right, followed by an impossibly tight, diving turn that a plane of its size had no right to execute. Hartmann's carefully aimed burst sliced through empty air. The exclamation was torn from him. The Thunderbolt hadn't run. It had turned into him. And it was now filling his windscreen, growing at an alarming rate. But more alarming than its sudden agility was the sight that greeted him as it presented its broad wing. 4 long, ominous black snouts protruded from each wing root. 8 in total. And they were all pointing at him. In that frozen, heart-stopping millisecond, the laughter died in Erich Hartmann's throat, replaced by a primitive, ice-cold understanding. This was not a cow. This was a bear. A very fast, very angry bear with 8.50 caliber teeth. Thatch had executed a simple, brutal maneuver they'd been drilling for months, the Thatch weave, though he didn't call it that. It used the Jug's surprising roll rate and dive acceleration to convert a defensive position into a lethal firing pass. As his aircraft stabilized, the 109, committed to its diving attack, flashed through his gun sight. He didn't lead it much. He didn't have to. He simply placed the pipper on the grey fuselage and squeezed the trigger on his control stick. The sound was not the tat-tat-tat of a rifle or even the slower, heavier thump-thump-thump of cannons. It was a continuous, ripping, tearing roar, like the world's largest sheet of canvas being shredded by giants. 8 streams of fire, each gun firing 800 rounds per minute, converged 300 yards in front of his aircraft. The combined muzzle flash lit up his cockpit with a hellish, strobing light. Tracer's every fifth round was a glowing red phosphorus marker stitched a flaming line across the sky that intersected perfectly with the Messerschmitt. The effect was cataclysmic. The 13mm rounds from the 109's guns were like bee stings. The .50 caliber slugs from the Thunderbolt were sledgehammers. They didn't puncture, they shattered. They didn't wound, they disintegrated. Hartmann saw the fiery lines reach out for him, impossibly fast, impossibly dense. He yanked back on the stick, trying to climb, to escape the torrent. It was too late. A sound like 1,000 hammers hitting an anvil at once reverberated through his airframe. The canopy starred and blew away in a shower of plexiglass shards. The instrument panel exploded in his face. A savage blow struck his right leg. The beautiful, precise song of the Daimler-Benz engine choked into a cacophony of shrieks and metallic tears, then his sleek, predatory 109 was suddenly a dead, riddled weight, shuddering as it began a helpless, tumbling descent. The last thing he saw, through a haze of smoke and pain, was the huge, radial-engined shape of the Thunderbolt sailing past him, rocketing away with a speed that belied its size, already seeking its next target. There had been no graceful duel. No test of skill. It had been an execution. An industrial annihilation. Fischer, Hartmann's wingman, had watched the encounter in stunned disbelief. He had seen the 109 dive, he had seen the P-47 perform its shocking maneuver, and then he had seen his leader's aircraft simply come apart. It didn't smoke gently or trail flame. It was bludgeoned from the sky in a 2-second burst of concentrated firepower. The laughter was now a distant, shameful memory. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his system. He broke off his own dive, pulling back on the stick so hard the blood drained from his head, graying his vision. He had to get away. He had to climb. The 109's one advantage. He pointed the nose at the cloud layer above, the engine screaming at full military power. In his cockpit, Thatch saw the second 109 break. "Shorty, he's yours. Don't follow him up. You know the drill." Lieutenant Jenkins, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest, acknowledged. He didn't try to climb after the fleeing German. Instead, he nosed his own jug over into a shallow dive, building up speed. The Thunderbolt, in level flight or a dive, was one of the fastest aircraft in the sky. The massive engine and the sleek, despite its looks, laminar flow wings turned it into a freight train on rails. Jenkins watched the altimeter unwind as the airspeed needle crept past 400 miles per hour. The 109 was a shrinking silhouette above him, clawing for altitude. Jenkins waited. He let the speed build, feeling the airframe hum with the strain. Then, when he had a massive speed advantage, he pulled back on the stick, beginning a high-speed zoom climb. The jug shot upwards like a cannon shell, its inertia carrying it far higher than the 109 could manage on engine power alone. Jenkins found himself rising past the German fighter, looking down on its cockpit. The German pilot, Fischer, looked up in sheer terror, seeing the monstrous shape eclipse the sun. Jenkins rolled inverted, pulled through, and came down on the 109's tail in a high side attack. Again, he didn't need a perfect deflection shot. He just put the pipper on the enemy aircraft and tapped the trigger. Another short, ripping burst. Another sledgehammer blow. The 109's tail assembly disintegrated. The aircraft flicked into an uncontrollable spin, trailing debris and smoke. Jenkins broke away, scanning the sky. 2 passes. 2 kills. The fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. The radio crackled. Splash 2 bandits, Thatch's voice said, devoid of triumph, all business. Form up. We've got bombers to meet. On the ground in a Belgian field, Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann dragged himself from the shattered wreckage of his 109. His leg was broken, his face cut. Farmers approached cautiously. As they helped him, one of them pointed a gnarled finger at the sky, where the Thunderbolts were now distant specks escorting the vast, glittering formations of bombers deeper into Festung Europa. The farmer spoke in broken German. Der Donnerkeil. The Thunderbolt. Hartmann looked at the smoldering remains of his aircraft, a machine he had believed to be the pinnacle of aerial combat. He thought of the terrifying, all-enveloping roar of those 8 guns, the instant, total destruction they had wrought. He did not feel shame at being shot down. He felt a profound, paradigm-shifting shock. The rules had changed. The knights were gone. The brawlers had arrived, and they carried baseball bats. The laughter was over. Back at the 56th Fighter Group's base at RAF Halesworth, the mood was not one of boisterous celebration, but of grim, focused satisfaction. In the debriefing hut, the air thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and cigarette smoke, Thatch stood before his men. They thought we were slow. They thought we were fat. They thought they could bounce us and scoot. He paused, letting his eyes sweep over the young, tired faces. Jenkins still had a slight tremor in his hands from the adrenaline. Today, they learned different. They learned about roll rate. They learned about dive speed. They learned about 8.50 calories. He picked up a spent .50 caliber shell casing from a table, holding it up. It was huge, heavy, a blunt instrument of brass and lead. This isn't a bullet. This is a message. And we're going to keep delivering it until they stop laughing for good. The room was quiet. They understood. This wasn't about chivalry. This was about survival, about protecting the bombers, about winning. The P-47 was their tool, their blunt, brutal, beautiful tool. The news of the encounter spread through the Luftwaffe fighter wings like a cold virus. Pilots who had once scoffed at intelligence photos of the Thunderbolt now studied them with a new, wary respect. The term Jabo-Reiter, fighter-bomber rider, once a term of derision for the Thunderbolt pilots, began to sound less humorous. Stories were told in hushed tones in ready rooms, of 109s being literally sawed in half by a single burst. Of Focke-Wulfs having their entire engine assemblies torn clean off the airframe, of the terrifying resilience of the Jug, coming back to base with holes big enough to crawl through, cylinders shot away, its pilot unscathed. The P-47, they learned, could absorb punishment that would doom any German aircraft. It had a radial engine that could lose multiple cylinders and keep running. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. It was built not just to fight, but to endure. A new tactic emerged in the Jagdgeschwader. Don't get in front of the Acht-Zero, the veterans warned the newcomers, using the American caliber designation. Hit them from above, one pass, and then laufen. Run. Do not, under any circumstances, try to turn with them at low altitude. Do not try to outdive them from a level start. And for God's sake, never, ever let them get their guns on you. The confidence of the German pilots, once sky high, began to develop a hairline crack. The hunter was becoming the hunted. The Thunderbolt, with its incredible speed in the dive, made the classic German hit-and-run tactics perilous. A 109 could dive away, but a determined Jug pilot, starting from a higher altitude or with more speed, could often catch it, riding it down like an avenging angel, those 8 guns waiting to speak. The emotional pivot wasn't just in the Luftwaffe. For the American pilots, flying the Jug forged a unique bond. They weren't the sleek, glamorous knights of the air in their Spitfires. They were the blue-collar workers of the sky, the tough guys. They embraced the Jug's ugliness, its brutality. They painted garish, nose art on its massive engine cowlings, snarling tigers, cartoon characters wielding hammers, voluptuous women. They gave their aircraft names like Wicked Wabbit, Big Stud, and Hun Hunter. They took a perverse pride in bringing back aircraft that looked like they'd gone through a meat grinder. A pilot landing a shot-up P-47 would be met with slaps on the back and shouts of "Way to bring the old Jug home." The aircraft was more than a machine, it was a companion, a protector. Its very weight, which made it slow to climb, gave it a stable, reassuring feel. In a high-speed dive, it was a rock, not buffeted by turbulence like the lighter German fighters. Pilots learned to trust it with their lives in a way that was deeply personal. One such pilot was Captain Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron. On a mission over Germany, his P-47, nicknamed Lucky, was jumped by a flight of FW190s. A 20mm cannon shell exploded in his cockpit, shattering the instrument panel and wounding him in the leg and face. Another shell tore a gaping hole in his wing. His canopy was shredded, the wind screaming through the cockpit at 300 miles per hour. His engine was smoking, losing oil pressure. For 20 minutes, Johnson fought a desperate, running battle, diving, twisting, using the Jug's ruggedness to absorb hits that would have killed a 109. He was alone, badly wounded, his aircraft dying around him. But those 8 guns still worked. In a final, defiant act, as a 190 settled on his tail for the kill, Johnson stood the Jug on its wing in a desperate, high-G turn he didn't think it could make. The 190 pilot, overconfident, tried to follow. The heavier, more stable Thunderbolt held the turn. The lighter Focke-Wulf stalled, wobbled, and for a split second, presented its broadside to Johnson. He fired. A 1-second burst. The 190 vanished in an explosion of metal and fuel. Johnson, half blind from blood and oil, somehow nursed his shattered Jug over 200 miles of enemy territory, across the channel, and made a dead-stick landing on the first English field he saw. When he climbed out, the ground crew wept at the sight of the aircraft. It was a testament. The story of Lucky and Johnson became legend, proof of the bond between man and machine, of the Jug's impossible toughness. As the war progressed and the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, the Thunderbolt's role evolved, and with it, the German pilots' dread. The P-47D model arrived with a new, teardrop canopy that gave better visibility, and more importantly, underwing pylons for bombs and rockets. The Jabo-Reiter was no longer just a fighter, it was a fighter-bomber, a jagged bomber of unparalleled potency. Now, the sight of Thunderbolts in the air didn't just mean a deadly dogfight. It could mean your airfield was about to be cratered by 500-pound bombs. Your train was about to be strafed into scrap metal. Your tank column was about to be annihilated by high-velocity rockets. The laughter had long since ceased, replaced by a sullen, fearful respect. They called it Der Geflügeltod, the winged death. It was omnipresent, relentless, and carried a payload of destruction that was both aerial and terrestrial. The final, crushing demonstration of the Thunderbolt's dominance came not in a dogfight, but in the wholesale destruction of the Luftwaffe itself during Big Week and the subsequent battles for air superiority. Flying as escort, the Jugs would fend off the German interceptors. Then, when the bombers turned for home, the Thunderbolts were released to go down on the deck. They would streak across the German countryside at treetop height, their 8 guns and their bombs and rockets turned on anything that moved, locomotives, trucks, staff cars, grounded aircraft. They ravaged the logistical network of the Third Reich. They strafed airfields, destroying planes on the ground, killing mechanics, blowing up fuel dumps. The psychological impact was devastating. A German pilot could no longer feel safe even on the ground. The sanctuary of his own airfield was violated by the very aircraft he had once mocked. The fear became tangible, corrosive. For a young replacement pilot arriving at a Jagdgeschwader in late 1944, the veterans didn't talk of glorious victories against Spitfires. They talked of survival. They pointed to the sky and said, "Beware the dick autos, the fat cars." They spoke in haunted tones of being jumped by jugs, of seeing entire flights decimated in a single, roaring pass. The cocky confidence of 1941 was a distant memory. These men were tired, outnumbered, flying aircraft that were being outperformed and outgunned. And always, lurking in the sun or screaming up from the ground, was the Thunderbolt. The emotional core of this story is one of shattered arrogance and earned respect. It is the story of a technological and tactical surprise that changed the emotional landscape of a war. For the German pilot, the P-47 transformed from a joke to a nemesis, a symbol of the overwhelming, industrial might of America that was now being brought to bear directly on him. It was the end of the myth of individual German technical and tactical superiority. For the American pilot, the P-47 was a symbol of resilience, of punching above your weight, of proving the doubters wrong. It was an ugly plane that did a beautiful thing. It kept its pilot alive and brought the war home to the enemy with terrifying efficiency. The laughter that once echoed in the skies over Europe didn't fade away, it was silenced, decisively and permanently, by the ripping, thunderous roar of 8.50 caliber machine guns, a sound that became the soundtrack to the Luftwaffe's defeat. The silence after the guns was the loudest sound. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of a beast holding its breath, waiting to see if the threat had passed. Captain James Thatch leveled off his P-47, the Dumbo, and scanned the empty sky where the 2 Messerschmitts had been. No parachutes. Just dissipating smoke and a few scattered pieces of debris drifting down towards the patchwork fields of France. His mouth was dry, his heart still hammering a rhythm against his ribs that felt like a runaway locomotive. There was no exhilaration. No hoop of victory. Just a cold, metallic taste in his mouth and a profound, bone-deep weariness. He'd seen it before, this instant transformation from a living, thinking enemy into physics, into falling metal and dissipating smoke. It never got easier to watch. It just got more familiar. Lead, this is 2. Splash 2. No shoots. Lieutenant Jenkins' voice crackled in his headset, tight, young, trying to sound professional but edged with the high-pitched tremor of adrenaline and shock. Jenkins had just killed a man for the first time. Thatch knew the sound. He'd made it himself, long ago over the Pacific. Roger, Shorty. Good shooting. Now check your 6 and form up. We've got a date with some B-17s. Thatch's voice was a flat, gravelly calm, a practiced instrument of control. The mission wasn't over. The fleeting fight with the 109s was an interruption, a commercial break in the main feature. The real job was ahead, a sprawling, slow-moving armada of bombers stretched across 20 miles of sky, plodding towards the industrial heart of Germany. They were the sheep. The P-47s were the sheepdogs. And the wolves were still out there, licking their chops from higher altitudes. He banked the jug gently, the massive wings tilting the world, and looked back for his wingman. Jenkins' aircraft, Oklahoma Okie, slid into position off his right wing, a comforting, hefty presence. Thatch gave him a quick thumbs up through the canopy, a small, human gesture in the sterile, oxygen-fed world of 25,000 feet. Jenkins returned it, the movement jerky. He'd be processing what just happened for the next week. If he lived that long. They flew on, climbing steadily towards the rendezvous point. The Pratt & Whitney engine was a deep, contented rumble, a sound of immense, dependable power. Thatch loved this engine. He trusted it more than he trusted most people. It would run on hope and fumes if you asked it to. The airframe around him, for all its brutish looks, felt solid, reassuring. It was a flying tank. You didn't sit in a P-47, you wore it. It was armor. And today, that armor had just been proven. The Germans' cannon shells, if they'd hit, would have stung. His own .50 calibers had erased the enemy from existence. It was an unequal equation, and for the first time in the air war over Europe, the inequality was swinging decisively in America's favor. But the Germans hadn't gotten the memo yet. Not all of them. They'd keep coming. They'd keep laughing, right up until the moment the world turned into a storm of lead and fire around them. Thatch's job was to be the messenger delivering that memo, one burst at a time. Ahead, a smudge appeared on the horizon, resolving slowly into a breathtaking, terrifying sight. The bomber stream. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses, stacked in neat, precise boxes, their silver bodies glittering in the weak sun like a vast, migrating city of metal. The sight never failed to stir something in Thatch: awe, dread, fierce protectiveness. Each of those bombers carried 10 men. Each was a slow, vulnerable target. And they were going straight into the lion's den. His squadron's role was to shepherd them through the first leg, the fighter belt, where the Luftwaffe's interceptors would be thickest. Then they'd hand off to other groups, their fuel running low, and turn for home. It was a brutal, unglamorous shuttle service of death. As they slid into position above and to the side of the lead combat box, Thatch's radio erupted with chatter. The bomber crews, nervous, their voices tinny with static and tension. Reports of flak up ahead. Spotters calling out bogeys at 10 o'clock high. The ballet of death was beginning. He scanned the sky above the bombers, his eyes aching with the strain of searching for the telltale specks that meant trouble. The Germans liked to come from above, out of the sun, diving through the bomber formations with their heavy cannon, then diving away before the escorts could react. The P-47s, with their poorer climb rate, had to anticipate, to be in the right place before the attack developed. It was a game of chess played at 300 miles per hour with lives as the pieces. Bandits! Bandits! 12 o'clock high? Many of them. Jesus, look at them all. The panic in the bomber radio operator's voice was palpable. Thatch looked up. The high sky, which had been a clear, empty blue, was now dotted with black, growing specks. Dozens of them. Not just 109s this time. The angular, shark-like shapes of Focke-Wulf 190s were mixed in. A Fulgish-Waiter strength interception. This was it. The main event. All right, Wolfpack, Thatch's voice cut through the chatter, calm, authoritative. This is what we're here for. Remember the drill. We take them head on. Break them up before they reach the bombers. Do not, I repeat, do not get sucked into a turning fight. One pass, then reform. Shorty, stick to me like glue. Everybody else, watch your wingman. Let's go to work. He pushed the throttle forward to the gate, then threw it into war emergency power. The big double wasp engine bellowed, a deep-throat roar of fury. The Jug leapt forward, acceleration pressing him back into his seat. The rest of his squadron, 16 Thunderbolts in all, followed suit, a phalanx of radial-engine giants climbing to meet the diving Germans. It was a clash of philosophies. The Germans, lighter, more nimble, relying on the quick, slashing attack. The Americans, heavier, more powerful, relying on sheer firepower and disciplined tactics. The two formations closed at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour. The world shrank to the circle of his gunsight and the growing shapes of the enemy aircraft. Thach picked a FW190 leading the pack. He could see the distinctive rounded wingtips, the squat, powerful shape. The German pilot hadn't broken off. He was committed, aiming for the bombers, perhaps not yet registering the threat of the climbing Jugs. Or perhaps he simply didn't respect it? Thach waited, his thumb resting lightly on the trigger. The range closed with terrifying speed. He could see the details now: the black crosses, the splintered camouflage, the glare of the canopy. At 800 yards, he fired a short, ranging burst. The tracers licked out, falling short. The 190 pilot jinked, a sudden, violent movement. But he was too late. Thach corrected, leading him slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The roar was apocalyptic. 8 guns firing in unison, a sustained, ripping snarl that vibrated through the entire airframe. The muzzle flashes lit up his wings. The stream of tracers converged into a solid, flaming rod that speared through the sky and struck the Focke-Wulf amidships. The effect was immediate and horrific. The German fighter didn't just smoke or catch fire. It seemed to come apart. A wing folded backwards, torn off at the root. The fuselage shattered into pieces. 1 second it was a deadly, coherent machine, the next, it was an expanding cloud of debris. Thach yanked the stick hard left, banking violently to avoid the collision and the debris. As he rolled, he caught a flash of another 190 sliding past his canopy, its pilot's face a pale, shocked oval behind the glass. The German was turning, trying to get on his tail. Thach ignored him. "Shorty! On your 6, he barked into the radio. He heard Jenkins' guns roar a second later, a shorter, more frantic burst. "Got him! He's going down!" Jenkins yelled. The kid was learning. The Thach weave was working. 2 Jugs, covering each other, were more than twice as deadly as one. The sky had descended into chaos. A swirling, screaming maelstrom of aircraft. The neat formations were gone. It was every man for himself, a deadly free-for-all set against the backdrop of the vast, stately bomber stream. Thach saw a B-17 take a direct hit from a 20mm cannon, its left wing shearing off in a gout of flame. The great fortress rolled onto its back and began the long, tumbling fall to earth, 10 men inside. His stomach clenched. Failure. But there was no time to mourn. A 109 was lining up on another bomber, ignoring the escort completely. Thach shoved the stick forward, diving, building up immense speed. The Thunderbolt ate up the distance. The German pilot, focused on his kill, never saw him coming. Another burst from the 8.50s. Another fireball. Another victory that felt like ashes. For 20 minutes, the battle raged. It was a blur of diving, climbing, turning, firing. The radio was a cacophony of shouts, warnings, screams. "I'm hit! I'm hit! Bail out. Bail out. Got the bastard. Mayday. Mayday. Thach's world was the cockpit, the gun sight, the sky, and his wingman. He fired until his guns were hot, until the ammunition counters ticked down towards zero. He took hits himself. A cannon shell exploded somewhere in his right wing with a heavy thump, making the whole aircraft shudder. Warning lights flickered on his panel. The engine ran rough for a moment, then smoothed out. The Jug shrugged it off. Slowly, inexorably, the tide turned. The German attack lost its cohesion. They had come for the bombers, but the Thunderbolts were a wall of fire they couldn't penetrate without devastating cost. The sky began to clear of grey shapes. The surviving Germans, low on fuel and ammunition, were breaking off, diving for the deck and the safety of their airfields. The P-47s, also low on fuel, couldn't pursue far. Their job was done. Wolfpack, Wolfpack, this is lead. Break off. Reform on me. Let's go home. Thach's voice was hoarse. He was drenched in sweat under his flight suit, his muscles trembling with fatigue. One by one, the surviving Thunderbolts appeared, forming up around him. He did a quick count. 14. They'd lost 2. He knew the pilots. Young men. Faces from the mess hall. Gone. Swallowed by the sky. He pushed the thought down, deep. There would be time for that later, in the quiet of his quarters, with a bottle of bourbon for company. The flight back to England was long and silent. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion. Below them, the channel was a dull, grey sheet. Ahead, the green fields of Kent promised safety, a hot meal, a bed. But the war came back with them. It was in the silence of the men. In the bullet holes in the aircraft. In the empty spaces in the formation. As they crossed the coast, Thach looked over at Jenkins' plane. Oklahoma Okie had a long, ragged tear in its left horizontal stabilizer. It flew straight, though. The Jug was bringing its boy home. Thach gave another thumbs up. This time, Jenkins' return gesture was slower, more certain. The kid had aged 10 years in an hour. He'd killed. He'd seen friends die. He'd looked into the abyss and hadn't blinked. He was a veteran now. The laughter was gone from his eyes, replaced by something harder, older. The same look Thach saw in his own mirror every morning. They landed at Halesworth one by one, the big, rough-running engines growling as they taxied to their hard stands. The ground crews were already running out, their faces anxious, scanning the aircraft for damage, counting them. Thach cut the engine, and the sudden silence was a physical shock. He sat for a moment in the cockpit, the smell of hot oil, cordite, and sweat filling his nostrils. He unstrapped himself, pushed back the canopy, and climbed stiffly out onto the wing. The cool English air felt alien on his skin. His crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named O'Malley, was waiting. Rough one, Cap. Cannon hole in the wing. Standard delivery service, Sarge, Thach said, his voice raspy. Just dropped off the mail. He jumped down, his legs wobbly. How's she look? She'll fly, O'Malley said, patting the fuselage affectionately. Tough bird. Took a 20mm in the main spar and didn't complain. You're gonna need a new wing section, though. We'll have her ready by tomorrow. Tomorrow. The relentless, grinding cycle of the war. Fly, fight, repair, repeat. Thatch nodded his thanks and turned towards the debriefing hut. Jenkins fell in beside him, walking with a slight limp he hadn't had that morning. "You okay, Shorty?" Thatch asked. "Yeah, Skipper. Just got my foot tangled in the rudder pedals during that last scrap. It's nothing." He was quiet for a few steps. "Captain. That 109. The first one. I saw his face. Just for a second. He looked surprised." Thatch put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "They always are, son. They think they're the hunters. Right up until they find out they're the prey." He didn't say anything more. There was nothing else to say. The lesson had been delivered, in the harshest possible terms. In the debriefing hut, the intelligence officers were waiting with their clipboards and maps. The pilots slumped into chairs, their flying gear still on, the stink of fear and exertion clinging to them. They spoke in monotones, pointing to positions on the map, estimating numbers, confirming kills. The language was clinical, sterile: Angels 20, bandits at 12 o'clock, splash 1 FW190. It stripped the horror of its meaning, turned living, breathing men into data points. Thatch went through the motions, his mind elsewhere. He was thinking of the bomber that went down. Thinking of his 2 missing pilots. Thinking of the surprised face of the German in the 109. After debrief, there was the ritual of the bar. The officers' club was a converted Nissan hut, dimly lit, smoky, the air thick with the smell of beer and cheap gin. The pilots who had flown clustered together, not talking much at first, just drinking, letting the alcohol blunt the sharp edges of the day. Then, slowly, the stories would start. Not the official debriefing stories, but the real ones. The close calls. The stupid mistakes. The miraculous saves. Jenkins, with a couple of beers in him, started to talk about his kill, his voice gaining animation, the tremor gone, replaced by a brittle, forced bravado. The other pilots listened, nodded, offered their own tales. It was therapy. It was how they stayed sane. Thatch sat a little apart, nursing a bourbon. He watched them. These were his boys. Kids from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit and colleges in California. They'd been thrown into the most savage aerial combat in history, given a monstrous, ugly airplane, and told to win. And they were doing it. Not because they were better natural pilots than the Germans, many of them weren't. But because they had a better machine, better tactics, and a sheer, dumb, stubborn refusal to quit. The P-47 was the great equalizer. It turned earnest American boys into kings of the sky. Later that night, alone in his quarters, Thatch took out a letter. It was from his wife, Margaret, back in San Diego. She wrote about their son's first steps, about the price of groceries, about the roses in their garden. A world away. A world of sanity and peace. He read it twice, trying to imprint the words on his soul, to use them as a shield against the images of the day. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, next to his dog tags. It was his talisman. He lay on his cot, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling. The mission replay in his head on a relentless loop. The diving 109s. The ripping sound of his guns. The exploding FW190. The falling B-17. The surprised face. He closed his eyes, but the faces were there, waiting in the dark. This was the price. This was the hidden cost of every victory, every painted swastika on the side of his aircraft. He was saving the world, they said. For his son. For Margaret. For the roses. But to do it, he had to become a dealer of death on an industrial scale. The P-47 was his tool. A magnificent, terrible tool. And he was its master. Outside, the airfield was quiet. The moon rose over the Suffolk countryside, silvering the rows of parked thunderbolts. They sat on their hard stands like sleeping giants, their shadows long and dark. In the morning, the ground crews would swarm over them again, patching holes, filling fuel tanks, loading belts of .50 caliber ammunition. And the pilots would climb back into their cockpits, strap in, and fly back into the hell over Europe. The laughter of the Germans had been silenced today. But the thunder of the jugs would continue, day after day, until there was nothing left to fight. It was a grim, brutal business. But it was their business. And they were very, very good at it. The sun would rise on another mission. The engine would cough to life. The guns would be armed. And the message would be delivered again, written in fire and lead across the sky. The era of laughter was over. The era of thunder had begun. The thunder never really leaves you. It becomes a part of your internal weather, a low-frequency rumble in the bones, a permanent vibration in the soul. You land the jug, cut the engine, and the world goes silent, but the thunder is still there, echoing in the hollows of your memory. It's the sound of 8.50s speaking all at once. It's the sound of a Daimler-Benz engine tearing itself apart. It's the sound of a culture of aerial arrogance shattering against the unforgiving anvil of American industrial might. We didn't just win the war in the air, we changed its very language. We replaced the delicate poetry of the dogfight with the blunt, brutal prose of the hammer blow. The story of the P-47 is not a story of a machine. It is a story of a psychological revolution. When the first jugs appeared over occupied Europe, they were a question mark. To the young knights of the Luftwaffe, bred on a doctrine of agility and marksmanship, they were an absurdity. A punchline. A Jabo-Reiter - a fighter-bomber rider was a second-class citizen in the kingdom of the air. The laughter was real. It was the comfortable, condescending laughter of masters looking at a clumsy apprentice. It was the last pure laughter of the German fighter arm. That laughter died somewhere over the fields of northern France in the autumn of 1943. It didn't fade, it was extinguished. It was snuffed out in the time it took for a thumb to depress a trigger. For 8 hydraulic systems to cycle, for a torrent of half-inch slugs to traverse a few hundred yards of sky and turn a masterpiece of German engineering into a falling cloud of confetti. The pilots who survived that first, shocking encounter returned to their bases with stories that sounded like fever dreams. They spoke not of being outflown, but of being obliterated. They spoke of an aircraft that could dive like a stone, roll with unexpected violence, and absorb punishment that would doom any 109 or 190. And the guns. Always, they spoke of the guns. A wall of lead. A hailstorm. An industrial scythe. The emotional terrain of the air war shifted seismically. Confidence, that most crucial fuel for a fighter pilot, began to leak from the Jagdgeschwader like fuel from a ruptured tank. The tactical playbook, written in the skies over Spain and Poland and France, was suddenly obsolete. The energy trap, the hit and run, the vertical fight, all of it was compromised by the Thunderbolt's terrifying dive speed and lethal zoom climb. You could bounce a jug, but if you missed that first, perfect shot, you were no longer the hunter. You were prey, and the thing behind you was faster in a straight line, could outdive you to the deck, and carried an arsenal that made a mockery of your own. A new, grim mantra circulated: don't get in front of the Acht-Zero. Fear, a once foreign emotion reserved for green replacements, began to stalk even the aces with the knight's cross at their throats. For us, the men who flew the Jug, the transformation was inward. We never heard their laughter, but we felt its absence. We felt it in the way they began to break off attacks earlier, in the wary way they'd circle high above, reluctant to commit. We were no longer the clumsy newcomers. We were the storm they had to weather. Our bond with the aircraft was born not from its beauty, but from its profound, ugly capability. It was not a thoroughbred, it was a draft horse. It couldn't dance, but my God, it could plow. And in the skies over Europe, we were not dancing. We were plowing the Luftwaffe under. The P-47 became more than a fighter. It became a symbol of a new kind of warfare. The ground attack role, the Jabo mission they had sneered at, became its terrible masterpiece. With a 500-pound bomb under each wing and 10 rockets slung beneath them, a flight of Thunderbolts was a traveling apocalypse for anything on the ground. Tanks, trains, trucks, staff cars, airfield hangars all ceased to exist under the hammer of the Jug. The fear now descended from the sky and raced along the roads at treetop height. A German soldier or pilot could no longer look up with simple anxiety, he had to look up with dread, knowing the sight of those thick wings and that radial engine might be the last thing he ever saw. We weren't just contesting the air, we were strangling the ground. We made the very infrastructure of the Reich bleed. And through it all, the aircraft itself was our sanctuary. You sat in a cockpit surrounded by an engine that could lose cylinders and keep running, protected by armor plate they'd added because the airframe was too damn tough to need it elsewhere, with fuel tanks that sealed their own wounds. You came back with holes you could stick your head through, with control cables frayed and flapping, with the smell of cordite and leaking glycol permanent in your nostrils. And the Jug brought you home. It always wanted to bring you home. That reliability forged a loyalty deeper than any sleek, fragile beauty could inspire. We painted garish nose art on its massive cowling not to make it pretty, but to give this relentless, pounding instrument of war a soul, to make it ours. Hun Hunter. Big Stud. The Spook. These were our familiars, our champions. The closing chapter of the story isn't written in a climactic dogfight. It's written in the quiet, empty skies of late 1944 and 1945. The Luftwaffe, bled white by the attrition over the bomber streams and shattered on the ground by the Jabo raids, simply faded away. The contested skies became ours. The laughter had been replaced first by fear, then by resignation, and finally by a crushing silence. When we escorted the bombers in those final months, we often flew uneventful missions. The wolves were gone. We had not just beaten them, we had broken their spirit, and the weapon that did it was the one they'd laughed at. After the war, the world moved on to sleeker, faster, jet-age shapes. The P-47, with its radial engine and barrel fuselage, looked like a relic from a more primitive time. It was shuffled off to air museums and forgotten airfields, a curious artifact. But for the men who flew it, and for the men who faced it, it was never an artifact. It was an event. A force of nature. I stood at an air show years later, an old man among the crowds, watching a meticulously restored Jug fire up its engine. The crowd winced at the raw, grating roar of the double wasp. They saw an ugly, chunky airplane. But when it taxied past, I didn't see a museum piece. I saw my cockpit. I felt the stick in my hand, the throttle against my palm. I saw the faces of my wingman Jenkins, O'Brien, all the bright-eyed boys who grew old in seconds over Abbeville or Bremen. I heard the chaotic, desperate crackle of the radio, the calm voice of my squadron commander, the deafening, righteous roar of my own guns. I smelled the oil and the sweat and the fear. And I remembered the silence that followed the thunder. The profound, uneasy silence of a sky we owned. We hadn't just won the air war. We had ended a myth. We proved that in the modern age, courage and skill could be overwhelmed by power, resilience, and the cold, calculated application of industrial strength. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not a graceful weapon. It was an honest one. It told a simple, brutal truth, that in the end, the weight of metal always wins. The knights, with their lances and their codes, were magnificent. But they could not stand against the cannon. So let the history books talk of strategy and production numbers. Let the documentaries show the graceful arcs of Spitfires. The real story, the human story, is written in the emotional journey from derision to dread. It's the story of the last laugh, and how it was silenced forever by a thunder that still echoes, if you know how to listen. It's the story of an ugly, magnificent, thunderous juggernaut that taught the world a simple lesson: never laugh at the man with the bigger hammer. For he is not coming to duel. He is coming to demolish. And in the clear, cold air over a dying continent, demolition is what we delivered. Day after day. Mission after mission. Until the only thing left flying was the truth, and the truth was thunder.